meeting, de staatshoofdenmeeting. We zijn dus momenteel in Torarica, Royal Ballroom, waarbij er dus net een panel meeting is gestart, waarbij er dus enkele organisaties een presentatie zullen.
Van mijn kant uit, goedemiddag vanuit de ballroom van Hotel Torarica. En Gretel, het gaat namelijk om 3 organisaties van de CARICOM. En dat zijn de Caribbean Community Climate Change Center, de 5 C's. En zij gaan meer een presentatie geven over het milieu. Verder hebben we de Caribbean Development Bank, CDB. Financiële zaken praten. En als laatst hebben we de Caribbean Center voor Renewable Energy en Energy Efficiency. Dat is de CCREEE. En ja, dat was het.
Ja, zoals jullie horen is de presentatie al gestart. Dus we gaan niet te veel van uw tijd verdoen, maar we gaan dus direct over naar de presentatie. Geniet u ervan.
Ja.
Is to build greater resilience to extreme storm events and to drought conditions by using renewable energy and reliable energy sources, it decentralizing the collection and water collection and storage, as well as it promotes adaptation and mitigation initiatives in the water sector. And obviously it's going to have a mitigation impact where it's actually decreasing CO2 emissions. The project has 4 components. The first component is to improve and increase resilience to storm events by reducing the carbon footprint in Barbados. And this project will see the installation of 4.5 megawatts of renewable energy at the 3 pumping stations in Barbados. Those of you who know Barbados knows Barbados is very flat, and if you don't have energy to pump the water doesn't go anywhere. And so what is happening here is that if there's a storm event that causes the grid, this power source to go down, there's the inability to pump water. And so what we're doing here is installing solar PV systems at each of the 3 pumping stations, so that there's a backup in the event that the power source goes, that you still have energy. And in addition to that, we are installing a 2.2 megawatt of micro gas turbine using natural gas. So there's a backup to the backup to ensure that there is water that can be pumped. As part of this project, 773,000 tons equivalent of CO2 will be avoided by 2030, which is also meeting the nationally determined contribution commitments of Barbados. Component 2 is a very innovative project. A component is expanding adaptation and mitigation initiatives through a revolving fund. So from the solar PV systems that will be installed at the pumping stations, that energy is going to be sold into the grid, and the savings from that is going to generate approximately $300,000 per year. And that fund is a revolving fund that households and small businesses and communities can access at concessional terms to be able to pursue water conservation, water energy efficiency projects at a rate of no more than 5%, with a 3 to 6 month moratorium on that facility. This facility has a tremendous ability to be scaled, depending on the size of the projects in your various countries. And as you can see, the charter has been developed, the criteria has been developed, and we're hoping that once the energy starts to be sold into the grid, that it will start to generate the resources from which the households and individuals can access concessional financing. The third component is a large portion of the project, and I think this particular component is something that is going to be of significant interest to most of the water-stressed countries. So the first is that it's going to install a 50,000-gallon tank at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, obviously to provide water resources to the hospital. It's going to provide water for farmers, farmers to benefit from harvesting rainwater, and they'll use that in irrigation for their fields. It will provide 1,500 vulnerable households with a personal water tank. Again, this is aligned to the National Adaptation Plan of Barbados. 9 polyclinics will be retrofitted with tanks for rainwater collection. It's going to produce a climate change adaptation master plan for the government of Barbados. It is going to install a SCADA system to reduce non-revenue water significantly by the utility. And it's going to replace 16 kilometers of old mains for the government of Barbados. And so by 2023, it is expected that it's going to be, they're saving about 480,000 gallons of water a day from that is currently being lost as non-revenue generating water. 6,000 persons will benefit from rainwater collection, and it's going to impact 58,000 people in the country of Barbados. The fourth component is a huge capacity building component. We'll see 500 of BWA workers being trained in ISO 400, which is occupational health and safety. 500 of the employees will be trained in gender and performance standards and in vision, and it's going to have quite a large impact on community groups and the training and use of water resources. So that's the 4 component of the project. This slide just in a sense summarizes very quickly what the project will deliver. I went through them, so I'm not going to go over them again, but you can see significant impact in the water resilience of Barbados. Now, this slide, so that's the easy part, what the project is delivering. But how to access the money from the Green Climate Fund is always the challenge. And for this particular project, what we had to do was to develop what we call the climate rationale. In other words, those of you who try to access money will know that the climate financing architecture has artificially separated the development finance from the climate finance. And they want you to be able to show a climate rationale to demonstrate that this is in fact going to solve a problem that has been caused by climate change. This is often the most inhibiting factor of getting money from the Green Climate Fund. And in Barbados, we had to undertake a feasibility study that costed $1 million to develop, to do, but we were able to successfully convince the Green Climate Fund that this was in fact a climate change project. So the graphs on the screen are showing you on the one on my left that is going up. It shows that temperature in Barbados has been increasing. And the one on the right is showing you precipitation, that rainfall has been decreasing over that period of time and also into the future. So when we look at the various models, you can see that there's a clear link between increase in temperature and a decrease in precipitation. The other slide is very important because what this shows you is the standard precipitation index and the projections over a year. And what I want you really to look at is the blue is your standard precipitation index, and the red means that you're getting less than what you normally will get in terms of rainfall with drought conditions. And what you see is that the projection for Barbados into the future, and they've already been experiencing quite a bit of drought, is going to get even more severe, significantly so. And you can see once you pass 2030, there's very few years in which you would have enough water. And Barbados, as you know, has just water stored in aquifers. They don't have surface water. This other graph shows you clearly again the relationship between rainfall and salinity, or measured by, in this case, chlorinity. If you look at the top graph and the bottom graph, what you can clearly see is a link between droughts and salinity. It's a mirror image. When you see a red at the bottom, you see a spike at the top. So again, when you have drought conditions, what is happening is the salinity of the aquifers is starting to increase. Again, a very clear climate connection to this. Now, this sounds easy here, but to actually get the data, to be able to show this climate rationale is absolutely very difficult in most countries. And that is why it takes so long to access the financing. In this case, this project took 3 years from the submission of a concept to when we first got resources, and then it's going to take 5 years to implement, 8 years in total. Now, this project has some critical success factors that the 5Cs believes can be scaled across the region. One, it has extremely high country ownership at the very highest political levels and at the technical levels. The project is not treated as an appendage in a ministry. There are dedicated staff from the BWA who do this project. We have a team from the 5Cs that sit in offices within the BWA. We have a co-chair, where it's co-chaired by the 5Cs and by the BWA. And this project has won Green Globe Energy Award, very prestigious award, and it's the best implemented project globally for the GCF in SIDS. So it demonstrates that we have the capacity to be able to deliver and implement projects at scale in the region. And if we can do this in all of the other countries, but we need these elements and critical success factors. We also have some innovative components, like that revolving facility that can provide concessional financing to households and small businesses. It has distributed storage of both water and distributive storage of energy. And it also demonstrates a hybrid between fossil fuel use, because the microturbines are going to be run using natural gas, and it's going to have solar PV system. So it's really making the water sector extremely resilient. So if there's another storm in Barbados that knocks off the grid, these systems will power up and provide the entire country with water. In terms of the overall project, and I'll end in just 2 more slides, you can see 80% of the $45 million have already been committed. Had it not been for COVID, it would have been a little bit more. The 5Cs has the fiduciary systems in place to be able to handle projects of this size. And despite the supply chain constraints that we've been facing in terms of getting equipment shipped from China to the region, we are making significant progress. But again, this would not have been possible without the strong ownership and leadership from the government of Barbados and from the Barbados Water Authority. We are also developing a project for Barbados that is another $50 million project. This one has already been submitted to the Green Climate Fund. We're hopeful that it gets approved in October of this year. And again, we're using the same elements of success that was already proven in the first project that was $45 million to design and implement this $50 million project. And this one is now going to make the wastewater sector of Barbados resilient. Okay, so we've dealt with the potable water, and now we're dealing with the wastewater in Barbados. And what's very interesting about this particular one is that we're going to upgrade the water treatment of the facility using renewable energy. That water is going to be pumped to the agricultural sector of Barbados. There's going to be some reinjection wells that is going to replenish the aquifers in the rainy season, and in the dry season, farmers will use it on their farms. Again, dealing with the issue of water availability and conservation. Here are some of the project deliverables that will be delivered under this project. Again, this one has not yet been approved, but it has been submitted and is making its way through the GCF, and we hope to be able to get this in October of this year. And then just to end, the water adaptation project in Barbados is a blueprint that can be easily scaled across CARICOM. The critical success factors are a sine qua non. You have to be able to have the ownership at the design, at the approval, implementation stage. What we find sometimes is that the projects are treated as an appendage, an afterthought in some countries where you don't have dedicated personnel because they're busy doing their regular jobs. And because of that, it really slows the access and the delivery and implementation of projects. The issue of data is always going to be there, but the 5Cs has been working with CIMH and Cuba, and we have a whole set of tools at the center that can help with the climate rationale. And the GCF is also starting to make some changes in terms of utilizing proxy data that we can use in the proposals that we develop. And then, of course, the 5Cs stand ready to work with member states to be able to access finance. The CDB and the 5Cs are the two regional implementing entities to the Green Climate Fund and to the Adaptation Fund. So I'll end there. Deputy SG, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Young. And colleagues, you have been taken through a very thorough presentation on an example of a project that is designed to benefit the people of the Caribbean, albeit just the island of Barbados. But that is an example of what one of our regional institutions can do, and the kind of service that is provided by a CARICOM institution to the people of the region. For those of you who walked in a bit late, the 5Cs, which is based in Belize, has that responsibility of ensuring that we undertake significant work in the area of climate change, not just the science, which forms a huge part of the work of the 5Cs, but also in terms of some of the practical solutions to ensure that as a region we can adapt to the issues of climate change, but there are also some significant mitigation interventions that are undertaken as well. So I want to thank Colin for that presentation. We can open the floor now if you have any comments, questions, interventions, observations that you wish to make. I recognize Suriname.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. My name is Silvano Chanahen from Suriname. Well, first of all, thanks for the presentation. While I'm still contemplating whether this model would be suitable for Suriname, there are some questions for clarification. I do have. You mentioned the climate rationale, and I was wondering whether if we would apply this or expand this project to another country, do we have to go through that exercise again for the different country to see whether it's feasible and whether it answers to the requirements of the Green Climate Fund? I must say that I have to remark that every time I hear a presentation about Green Climate Fund, I'm confronted with the 3 years preparation time, which is something that I'm sure annoys every politician in this room, because there's a 3-year cycle for the preparation of a program, of a project, which is almost the same as the election cycle of a government, and which is, it makes little sense, to tell you the truth. I'm sorry to say. So I hope that we can build that capacity in the Caribbean for us to shorten the preparation time for projects like these. But as I said before, I need to digest this a little bit more and see whether it's applicable. It will be applicable to Suriname. Thank you.
Thank you for that question, Minister. The time it takes to develop the project is usually linked to the data availability. And to be able to, the countries that have data, and Barbados is one of the countries that would have had quite a bit of data because they have, for example, the CIMH there, and they have a long history of recording things like temperature and precipitation levels, and the universities measuring things like salinity and so on. So in some areas, depending on the sectors, there might actually be the data already. When the data is already there, then the time can be significantly shortened. Because that usually is what takes the time, is to be able to get access to the data and then put it into the narrative to demonstrate that what we're trying to solve, the problem we're trying to solve, is a climate-related one. UNDP, which is a much larger entity than us, on average takes between 18 months to 2 years, and sometimes longer to develop projects, again based on the data. The 5Cs is a non-subvention entity, so we don't get subventions from member states, and so we have 5 developers who are meeting the demand of the region, which is clearly not enough. And so what happens is the demand is high, but we don't have the capacity to be able to deal with large-scale projects all at the same time. We have a pipeline of $300 million in the pipeline for countries, but in order to get those projects moved, we need to get them in front of donors as fast as possible. This is the other point you made, Minister, is an absolutely important one, where at the very highest levels, we have to have political advocacy to have the donors, particularly the Green Climate Fund and Adaptation Fund and other climate funds, to simplify the requirements for this level of data. Because the Green Climate Fund prefers to look at 30-year historical data, right? 30 years. And we have had conversations with them to be able to now use proxy data. In other words, if there's not data at the particular locality within a country or at the country level, that you could start to look at regional data and to use the IPCC reports, for example, that can be used at proxies, but so far that has not yet been approved in the board. And they also don't have programmatic approaches. So which means that we have to submit individual projects to the GCF, which takes time. So I already said that the Caribbean has 7 of the 37 most water-stressed countries in the world. This project could have been a programmatic approach for those 7 countries, which would have reduced the time of individually preparing 7 projects that would go to the fund. So we need that kind of approval to get the board members of the Green Climate Fund, who has 12 from developing countries, along with the developed countries, to look at how they can quickly approve the programmatic approach. The same for the Adaptation Fund.
Thank you very much, Minister. Thank you very much, Colin, for your responses. Would anybody else wish to come in with a comment, question, observation? And don't forget, this is an open session, so you just need to identify yourself and feel free to participate. Yes. Yes.
Montserrat.
Please go ahead, Montserrat.
Do you have a brochure, a leaflet on this project? Because I didn't want to get into too much technical questions at this time, because I'm really curious to know how you could generate that amount of, should I say, electricity to operate those pumps. But this is not so much for this. So if you have a leaflet or something that you could circulate, that would be useful.
Thank you. I will do.
Thank you. I would imagine, Colin, some of that information would perhaps also be on your website as well. So I think it would be useful, perhaps before the end of the presentation, if the website can be flashed on the screen, so those who are interested can make note of it. So thank you very much, Montserrat. Yes, I recognize Jamaica.
much, and thanks very much to the CCCC for the presentation. We just wanted to know whether the presentation would be made available either on the link or something like that. Thank you.
Yes, the presentation is available and to the Secretariat and can be made available to member states. Is there an online question? Does the project have a component dealing with, I lost it.
I think it was reforestation and recharging of aquifers. The $50 million project that is that is submitted to the Green Climate Fund that we hope to get approved in October does not have a reforestation component. But it does have a aquifer recharge component.
Good. Thank you. I don't see any other hands coming up.
Perhaps the last point I can make is what I think I want to commend the Secretariat for having sessions like this at this particular point in the agenda of the meeting, because it demonstrates that if we communicate more often and share success stories, that we can scale these things up and replicate them without reinventing the wheel. So as I said, this project is one of the best implemented for the GCF in SIDS globally. It has won awards, and so as I said, it's a blueprint. So we can technically use this and the success factors that I had there, the ownership, the country-drivenness, the alignment with national priorities and vision, having dedicated staff, having ownership at the level of civil society and including gender, all of these things we can do with other countries. And I think this is fantastic, DSG, for the kind of sharing that can happen to lead into subsequent investments for climate change.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Colin. And on behalf of the Secretariat, let me also thank the 5Cs for taking up this opportunity. As I mentioned in the beginning, we've never really had side events before during the caucus. So I think this is certainly something that we will be taking going forward, where whilst heads are in caucus, we utilize the time to connect with the rest of the delegations and the rest of our partners. So thanks for participating, and let me take the opportunity to invite CCREEE, Dr. Gary Jackson, Dr. Devon Gardner, and please, colleagues, if you have any last-minute thoughts on the first presentation, towards the end we will have perhaps 15 or 20 minutes for wrap-up, and we would ask all the panelists to then join us at the front. If you have any further questions, comments, observations, then these will be taken in the last 10 or 15 minutes of the presentation. The two gentlemen coming up, Dr. Devon Gardner and Dr. Gary Jackson. I'm sure the two gentlemen are no strangers to many of you in this room. They have both been involved in a lot of energy, renewable energy, energy efficiency work across the region and with many of your governments. So let me take the opportunity to invite, I guess, Gary, you would go first, or is it Devon?
Thank you, DSG. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I want to really spend the next couple of minutes talking through a story of how the CCREEE is helping member states to approach electricity sector planning going forward. A story which is helping the member states to include a variety of risks, a multiplicity of risks and hazards into its electricity sector plans going forward, which is different from how electricity sector plans have been developed historically. So that's why the title that you have seen, Fit for Purpose Electricity Sector Planning, fit for purpose because we're looking at the different vulnerabilities that are faced by SIDS, which include our low-lying continental member states that also have similar threats to climate change as the islands do. I don't have to go into the story about climate and climate threats. Most of you would have heard many of these before, and some of you are even better experts at climate change matters than I am. So trying to advance the slides. We'll see. It's not working.
I can get it for you then. I can follow.
Okay. Right. Okay. So while the slides are being worked on in terms of moving them, advancing them forward, the story starts with a simple issue. Well, I shouldn't say simple, but a well-known matter, or a well-known issue. One, our countries are mostly dependent on imported fossil fuels for their energy services. The electricity sector in particular depends a lot on heavy fuel oil and diesel for generation. In fact, when we look at the numbers, we are talking about around 85% of electricity being generated in the region. Upwards of 85% of electricity generated in the region is from fossil sources, well, oil and oil-based fuels, what we call oil derivatives, heavy fuel oil and diesel. Especially in the case of some of the small islands, diesel predominates. And that is a very clear issue that we have to face. But before I get into the story, I wanted to talk about the CCREEE a little bit. I wanted to share with you who we are, about the CCREEE. The CCREEE stands for Caribbean Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency. We are based in Barbados. We are an institution of CARICOM. My name is Devon Gardner. I'm the head of technical programs, and Dr. Gary Jackson next to me is the executive director. The CCREEE process of establishment of the CCREEE started in 2014, in November 2014, in terms of the CARICOM process of the CCREE's establishment. Earlier work, preparatory work, had started from around March 2014. The agreement that establishes CCREEE was adopted by heads of governments in July 2017 and entered into force in April 2018 upon ratification numbers that were received in keeping with the agreement, and the operationalization started in earnest in May 2018. And the CCREEE was established to serve as an implementation hub for sustainable energy. And in that regard, it's expected to assist the member states to transition to low carbon, secure and resilient energy futures. And of course, transform the energy system in the region from the dependence, as I mentioned before, on oil-based fuels to one that is dependent on many of the indigenous renewable resources that we have available at our disposal. So if we go to the next slide, this outlines what the strategic programs and pillars are of the CCREEE. Climate resilience is at the top of the pile for the reason that the Caribbean region and the CARICOM states as a whole are identified as among the most vulnerable countries in the world to climate change. In fact, the Caribbean region has been singled out as the most vulnerable region to climate change by the 5th assessment report of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in 2015. And one of the things we know is that within the context of that vulnerability, the energy system sits at the heart of that vulnerability. And so what we have is that in the region, we have a history of natural disasters, and those natural disasters are actually being exacerbated by the climate issues that we are facing, and those vulnerabilities are therefore expected to escalate the disasters that we already are used to, the flooding, the hurricanes, the storms, you name them. And the numbers I've shown, and Colin is here, he can always give you the more updated number, but in 2017, when the 5Cs did its last assessment, it had shown that over a 40-year period, there was around $9 billion that was lost in the CARICOM region alone due to hurricanes and storms. That's a significant amount of money. And then when we talk about another issue which is facing the countries, the issue of oil prices. A lot of the countries are importing oil and oil-based fuels. And we see what is happening in the world now in 2019, CARICOM countries would have paid around $64 per barrel average for imported oil. And we know what it is now. The average price of oil so far this year is $111 and something else. So you can see, when we do the calculations, at this point, at the end of June in 2019, for the same amount of oil that the region would have imported, they would have had to find $2 billion more collectively to import the exact same number of barrels of oil products, just to keep their energy systems running as it was before. So that's at the macro level. You know, we are talking about the fact that you are not putting any new amounts of oil, any new commodities, you're not doing any new work, any new production, or generating any new economic activity with that oil, but you are simply paying more because of the commodity price which have changed globally due to the geopolitical issues. What we know is that oil has become much more volatile now than it has ever been historically. And what we know is that it's going to continue to be more volatile as time goes. So the fact that countries have always had to find excess monies to pay for oil when the prices swing, the fact that countries could lose 200 and 220% of their GDP when one event occurs, as you would have seen with Grenada, Dominica, and other countries from time to time, has put the countries in significant challenges where economics are concerned in terms of being able to grow their economies on the one hand and being able to also even just manage the economies in a sustainable way. And countries have been racking up significant amounts of debt, and countries have a significant amount of debt per GDP ratios, which are quite high. So this climate resilience issue is important because for us to really arrest the matter of how it is that we can break the camel's back, if you want to call it, of not having this triple threat of high debt issues, not having the issue of these exacerbated natural disasters due to climate issues affecting the infrastructure as they are now, and of course the vagaries in oil prices affecting the energy systems as they are now. We need to look at the climate resilience within the energy sector, and that is therefore the top of the chain for us within the CCREEE. And within that context, everything that we do, looking at sustainable industries and businesses, energy access, buildings, transport, everything that we do within the CCREEE in terms of energy is built on a climate resilience pillar. So if we go to the next slide, what we will see is what a typical electricity grid looks like for those who may not be familiar. It's very linear. In most countries, what you have is centralized generators that generates power and sends that power through a transmission system, and then of course distributes that to end users. In some countries you don't have transmission systems. Some of the smaller countries may just have it going straight to a distribution system, but the story is still the same. You generate centrally, distribute through an electric grid, and then send that to consumers. What we have been doing in our approach to renewable energy integration for the large part has been to really add renewable energy generators at the end of the chain and the supply chain side. So we pretty much is just replacing fossil generators with renewable generators, but the configuration of the system as for the most part remain the same. We haven't been doing much with the grid. The grid remains in most countries exactly as it was 80 years ago, except for minor tinkerings and upgrades which we do from time to time to fix things as we go along, but there has not been any major overall. And so that's one of the challenges that we have had. If we go to the next slide, what we'll see is, the next slide, we will see that, when we take this approach, we will have some challenges in how we manage the integration of those renewables. This is a real wind farm in Jamaica, and a real date in Jamaica. This is showing what the production is in terms of how the wind is behaving throughout the day. You see how the wind power is ramping up and down throughout the day. It's not consistent. This is something that, of course, will affect how you manage the grid as a grid operator. If we go to the next slide, we will see we have the same challenges with solar. This is what we refer to as daily variability. Where we go to the next slide, we see the same challenge with solar. We have the same daily variability with solar. This is another real solar plant. we see the ramping ups, ramping down throughout the day, and this is something which has to be managed by the grid service operator. If we go to the next slide, we see, of course, we shift away from this daily variability. When we look at the totality of what this looks like in a system like Jamaica back in 2016, using that same period when those data was available. And I use that period deliberately because that was before the battery storage was implemented, because that was the solution that they had to look at. You can see what that means. That blue line, if there is the frequency, is showing the frequency, and you will see that the frequency is dipping. The frequency, which is supposed to be an average of around 50 hertz, is really, dipping really significantly when you have those kind of breakages and those kind of ramping ups and down of the power. If we if you click Hussein, you will see that that is where I'm showing it. If you go to the next slide now, you will see what Jamaica had to do, and Jamaica had to put in storage to deal with that. So while it is that we sometimes celebrate about 8.5 cents per kilowatt hour solar PV being auctioned and obtained for our systems, there will be additional costs that will come at, because at the end of the day, if you click on that, you'll see that Jamaica would have had to pick batteries and a flywheel hybrid system that was used to moderate, if you want to call it that, some of those fluctuations in voltage and frequency that was being experienced. And that is why, to a large extent, the issue of simply adding renewables, especially variable renewables, solar and wind, at the end of the grid as a part of a supply dynamics that is centralized, will not necessarily lead to the kind of resilient system that you want, would not necessarily lead to the kind of cost reductions that you want. So what really needs to happen is that there has to be a very judicious way through which you determine how to add renewables to the system and really how to redesign the entire architecture, and that's part of what the whole story is today. If we go to the next slide, we will see hydro also is a challenge, because hydro also has what we refer to as seasonal variability. Wind and solar is daily in terms of the variability. This is in Belize, a real hydro facility, number of hydro facilities there, and this is showing the up and down of those hydro productions there, and you see how it changes from month to month, and it's sometimes in years when there are drought becomes even worse than what you're seeing here. And the kind of wild swings in weather and climate can affect the hydrological cycle much more than it has in the past. So in a sense, what we are doing in terms of some of our renewable energy integration is shifting away from fuels that are from generation system that depends on fuels that are very volatile in terms of supply and cost. But then we are shifting towards generation sources that are very volatile because of their sensitivity to climate and weather. So we have to ensure that in the process of shifting, we are able to design the system so that it can compensate for and accommodate these kind of variabilities in climate, and that climate and weather will cause to our wind and solar and other types of sources that we are integrating. If we go to the next slide, we see that it's not just about the variability, there is also the vulnerability of the system. This is a real solar PV farm from St. Vincent after Maria passed. As somebody said when we asked, how do you build a resilient plant? Him say, no, build a diesel plant, it's easier, you won't have to walk and pick up the panels after the hurricane has passed. But that's a running joke that we have sometimes with the electric utility guys. But this is something that we have to understand when we are talking about building our solar farms. If we go to the next slide, we will see also that the grid is also, as everybody knows, one of those areas of significant vulnerability. We see oftentimes after hurricanes and storms pass that you have poles that are downed, wires that are down, and this was a case in the Bahamas. In fact, you have sometimes, even right here in Suriname, I passed a recent place that was flooded close to Afobaka, and I saw the substation completely covered in water when we went to do an assessment out there. So we know when that water recedes, that's all the equipment in that substation would have been completely damaged. If we go to the next slide, we see also that on the demand side, there is vulnerabilities. So, we can talk about improving the resilience and the generation side. So what if we were to build the wind parks so that they can be resilient to category 4 hurricanes, or we build them away from where the hurricanes, so that man build them in high ground so that they don't flood? What if we underground some of the transmission cables and try to use metal poles to improve the resilience of our transmission system and even our distribution system? If our end users are not able to use the electricity when the events would have passed, then you would have invested all this money, and then this money is not necessarily serving any purpose because the use of the energy that is being produced after the event would not be there because your end users are themselves not resilient. So the resilience has to be completely through the value chain of your sector, and so that's why a completely reorganized and reoriented architecture is important, and that requires a significant amount of modeling and a significant amount of planning work. If we go to the next slide, we will see what we are doing is building on what is called integrated resource planning. So the IRRP, which is integrated resource and resilience planning, is building on what is a well-known, well-accepted global planning mechanism called integrated resource plan. So there is a view or a common understanding and acceptance that given the significance of how much distributed side energy systems like rooftop solar and things like distributed energy resources such as energy efficiency measures will play, that there needs to be a widening of the planning process to multiplicity of stakeholders. So it's not supposed to be something that involves only electric utility players. So in a sense, the democratization of the planning process is something that is expected to happen as we democratize the use of energy within our societies, and that's what integrated resource planning seeks to do. And it's an accepted base for planning to happen where electric utilities resources are typically looked at, but also opportunities for the electric utility to interface with what we call prosumers, that is consumers who are also producing and feeding into the grid, and opportunities for demand-side management to look at what the long-term situation would be. And so in that regard, you would see there that all the different resources from gas to renewables like hydro, wind, solar, battery storage would be considered. You would see that different sections of the grid, including the way you transmit and distribute, would be considered. And of course, there's a significant amount of analysis that would go into the demand side, including the emergence of electrification in transport. That is something that would have to be considered. If we go to the next slide, what we see is that, so I lost my, okay, so no, okay, the clicker is not working. So if we go to the next slide, we see that what we are looking at is an evolved process where we look at integrated resource and resilience planning. The CCREEE has worked with its partners, the CARICOM Secretariat, the Caribbean Institute of Meteorology and Hydrology, the UWI, University of the West Indies Climate Studies Group in Mona, and a number of partners, CARILEC, which is the Association of Electric Services Providers, and the Caribbean Development Bank, CDB, were part of a task force. And the 5 Cs also. Colin, you weren't there at the time, but 5 Cs was a part of the task force. And we all sat and determined how best could we improve the integrated resource planning process so that the issues of vulnerability could be taken into consideration and contemplated for the reasons that we spoke about. If we are going to be investing in all of this transformation into renewables, we must ensure that what it is that we are putting in is capable of serving our needs for decades to come, because much of these projects are projects which will last 25 years and more. So the issue of how we build in resilience within it was important, and so that's what that extra R was, to ensure that within the process of understanding all the different options available to us, we were understanding them also through our risk lens by looking at the vulnerabilities of each of these systems. So we were using climate data and weather data that was based on climate change scenarios to understand the different impacts that there would be on the resources on the supply side, on the generators on the supply side, on the delivery systems, from the grids that are delivering the power to the end use side, and then of course on the demand side itself, trying to understand, for instance, how the change in rainfall would affect our hydro production, how would the change in heat. You hear Colin talk about temperature increases, or we change in some of even the slower onset issues like temperature increases affect your solar performance, the performance of your thermal generators. How would this affect the performance of your transmission and distribution systems? How would it affect even your demand side, the air conditioning performance, and even the air conditioning demand, and those kind of things. So those are some of the things which we try to answer. And then of course on the more dramatic side, where we have the natural disaster events, try to understand, what if we identify places for solar and different types of options. How would these power generations and power and energy resources, renewable energy resources, be affected by storms and floods and landslides and all these kind of things? How would the grid be affected? How would the end users be affected? And where can we find the most optimal way to redesign and re-architect and build out any new generators and to harden the existing generation and transmission and distribution systems? And how do we change the operation of the system to get the maximum from it in terms of a diversified system that is sufficiently flexible to meet the needs as things change? Because the name of the game going forward is flexibility. Because when you have increasing vulnerability and increasing volatility in your system, you have to become more flexible to deal with that. And that is what we are seeking to do, to find out what are the ways through which we can gain the maximum degree of flexibility to deal with and to rebound from any impact that the system will face. And so in that regard, what we use in the XRR is to ensure that the vulnerability is included. And we have also made sure that it's more inclusive, because then with vulnerabilities included, obviously climate and hydrometeorological people are going to be involved, and so are other stakeholders who are going to be important to understanding, how do we pay for vulnerabilities, and shifting from least cost to least regrets. I mean, we talk about it using the example of a car. When we buy a car, we don't necessarily go there to buy the cheapest car. We don't go there to buy the cheapest shoes. We don't go and buy the cheapest jacket. We try to find one that serves our needs, that is what is affordable to us. And in the process of doing so, our ability to afford it is what is important, not whether it is the cheapest one or not. And it's the same with electricity systems. We don't necessarily seek to get the cheapest system, but one that we can afford and one that is capable of serving our needs. And so we call that a least regrets pathway, and that's where we go. So what this does is ensure that there's compliance with policies and plans and regulations. We ensure that system resilience is built, reliability is built up. The way the integrated resource and planning also does is that the energy security is prioritized compared to many of the other approaches to planning. It looks to maximize economic benefits, not just by making the system cheaper, more cost effective, but also looking to see how we can integrate with sectors to do sector coupling and provide sector coupling opportunities that can maximize the way energy is used and focus on energy and the treatment of energy as a service, not as an end in itself. Addresses issues like energy access, so it doesn't just focus on the main grid, but it looks at energy and energy use throughout the whole electricity system, including those who are not tied to the national grid. Looks at environmental footprint, and it, of course, seeks to build resilience as the bottom line. And it's as a process that is iterative, a process that looks at, of course, the engineering models and how we do engineering modeling that links up with all of the typical forecasting and demand forecasting, supply side analysis and assessments that you would find your electric utility do. But then we also include in all of that a lot of demand analysis. We include in that a lot of transmission and distribution analysis. We include especially a lot of climate forecasting, a lot of hydrometeorological forecasting, a lot of risk assessments, a lot of hazard mapping, and we overlay the hazard maps really on top of the IRR and on top of the proposed, if you want to call it, the different projected pathways or scenarios that would emerge through our models to understand what would the vulnerability of each scenario that emerged from the engineering models look like. And then, of course, we keep improving the scenarios with the vulnerabilities built in until we get to something that is acceptable, because ultimately it's the stakeholders who decide. So what we really look at is how do we move from this traditional linear power sector architecture where the utility really generates and brings the electricity to you, and then you have to figure out how to deal with it, to a situation where you have a much more demand-driven approach, where there is a lot more interactiveness and interactions at every layer of the value chain, such that the democratization is happening, whereby customers can be part of the conversion, part of the storage, part of the generation and energy services at the center. And the last two slides is really this one and the one to come. What this aims to do is talk about is what Colin just spoke about. We know what climate change is doing. We see the anthropogenic climate change and the things that are emerging. We know that we have to adapt our energy system. We know we have to adapt our food and water system. We know that the built environment, part of which is also the electricity system, has to be adapted. And so we look to see how we can adapt all these, you know, our built environment, at least the electricity part, the electric grid is part of the built environment, which is most vulnerable. Most of it is coastal and hangs out there just, you know, in the open. And of course, the energy resources, looking at how it is that we can find ways and means of adapting our energy resources, especially, as we mentioned, they are more climate sensitive than before. And as we adapt those systems, what we will find is that our socio-economic pathway is what will become improved. So by adapting the energy system, we are able to adapt our socio-economic development pathway. And in adapting our socio-economic pathway, we can get to the stage of sustainable growth. We can get to the stage in which we are able to implement and roll out better technologies. And of course, that will serve the needs of our people better. And the co-product of all of that is that you get mitigation from it. You will get to save carbon, to reduce the carbon footprint. So we're not treating energy within the context of the IRRP through a climate lens where the main objective is just to see it reduce carbon at all costs. The main objective is to ensure that the system is resilient and that the system is capable of functioning in a way that is flexible and a way that will allow us to be able to meet our needs as we face the different kinds of hazards, climate hazards, epidemiological hazards, weather hazards, fuel hazards, whatever supply shocks that we may have. Our system is capable of meeting those shocks. So the key perspectives and messages are really these, you know, that at the end of the day, what we look at through the IRP is understand how we deal with size, how we deal with sites, how we deal with costs, recognizing that at the end of the day, we have to seek to get scale. That's why we are talking now about looking at regional projects for energy security with large-scale offshore wind and geothermal, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Look at how we can ensure that the large amount of renewables that are located in some of the small islands can be available to the region as a whole, and where many of the demand centers actually may not have as many cost-effective options available to them. Look at how the transaction and investment risk can be spread over multiple countries. And of course, within the context of all of this is to look through data, adapt the technology to markets, sector coupling I can't talk more about, and of course the issue of cost. As a Prime Minister of Jamaica once said, it takes cash to care, so you always have to figure out how you're going to pay for it. Understand it in the whole thing, how we're going to determine what aspects are public and what aspects are investment-based, because at the end of the day, we have to find ways and means of paying for some of those additionalities that are public service obligations. If you're talking about building more resilient infrastructure, do you pass on those costs directly to your ratepayers in a region which is already paying some of the highest costs in the world, or do you try to find ways to absorb some of those resilience building costs by not treating it as part of the investment that is going to be made by the electric utility? And of course, the issue of affordability and access is at the bottom line. So ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your time, and I am here to answer any questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Devon. It's a lot of information, I know, and it was, you know, it's just after lunch. So I hope you were able to absorb all of it, if not, well, most of it, if not all of it. And I would like to immediately open the floor. Any comments, questions, observations? Or is it that Devon overwhelmed you with so much information that you don't want to say a word after hearing so much? Yes, I see the CDF and Montserrat. We cannot hear you.
Okay, I think I'm on now.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you, Devon, for that very packed presentation. Just question of clarification from me with respect to the extra hour. You mentioned that it includes more inclusive stakeholder engagement. So if you could elaborate on how that adds to the resilience dimension, just elaborate a little bit on that. And secondly, moving from least cost to least regrets, how does that also lead to increased resilience in terms of process and outcome? Just some clarification.
Thank you very much, Mr. Suma. Montserrat, you're to come in and we'll take 2 interventions and then invite our goodly friends here to respond.
Thank you. Again, I will ask if you have paperwork, brochures, anything, because it was quite a bit to take in. I'm sure we all agreed. However, unless I missed it, I don't recall hearing any emphasis being placed on geothermal, for example. I know, unless I missed it, there are a number of Caribbean islands that have or are still exploring that. But let me speak specifically to Montserrat, the smallest of the grouping. We currently have 2 proven wells, already dug and capped, and are steaming are steaming quite heavily, and a half of another one just to complete, only to get into the generation mode. And as you rightly explained from the slide of the solar panels, how they are susceptible to strong winds. And of course, if you go into a hurricane, it's even worse. And even the turbines for wind can withstand certain amount of wind pressure. My question, are you open to, or you plan to include in your work anything to do with geothermal? And I just can't help noticing that some aspect of what you're saying or what you're dealing with overlay with the previous presenter. Because I'm really curious to know how we plan to operate those pumps to pump water from wherever, at such a cheap and sustainable way. If it's not solar as you're talking about, or wind as you're talking about, or geothermal as I'm suggesting. So I'm curious. So I guess we could put the 2 together at some point. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, DSG. I will start and then Gary might jump in. Rudy, I'm going to answer Montserrat first because it's easier to answer their stuff. Let me start by saying that while I was wearing a different hat in the CARICOM Secretariat, the first integrated resource plan for Montserrat was done through support from the CARICOM Secretariat. I don't know if you might have seen that IRP. It wasn't an IRRP at the time, it was an IRP. We did it with resources from the German government, with Siemens supporting us. And it was through that IRP that we determined at the time that there was need for an immediate injection of 1 megawatt of solar with batteries, so that 1 megawatt solar broken up into the 750 kilowatt and the 250 kilowatt that was designed. That came from an IRP that was done through support from CARICOM by Siemens. And we determined through that same study that you would eventually increase the solar capacity to 2 megawatts by 2025, and by 2030 you would have been bringing on around 4 megawatts to 8 megawatts of geothermal potential, depending on the growth of your economy, because there were some growth projections that would have been limiting factors in terms of how fast you would have introduce your geothermal. So the understanding was always that geothermal would have been a key part of Montserrat. We recognized at the time, however, that obviously there was a demand issue and there was need for demand building because of the size of the Montserrat grid, so we therefore had to look at options to do it cost effectively. One of the things that Gary will talk about when he responds to Rudy, hopefully, is the fact that because of the significant potential of geothermal, you could develop it quite cost effectively if you were to do it at larger scales. And one of the things we are working on within the context of the CCREEE is to see how we can look at multi-country approaches to developing geothermal and other types of projects that are cost effective, that could give you 4 or 5 cents per kilowatt hour if developed effectively, and to integrate them to provide baseload power for countries which do not have geothermal resources and other readily available baseload renewable resources to them. So it's something that we are looking at actively. It may not be submarine interconnections only that are contemplated, but even options for hydrogen production and other green fuels. So that's how I would answer Montserrat there. But yes, we work very closely with 5Cs. We very, very closely, because we understand that what Colin is doing and what we are doing are inextricably linked. Thanks.
Oh, Gary? Yes.
Yeah. I may add a few bits. Thanks DSG, and thanks Devon. One of the critical things for the IRP before I respond to Roddy is capacity building. What is important for us as a region is training and allowing us to manage these systems by ourselves and allowing us to plan for these systems in the future. So one of the things that we have done, we have established a very structured capacity building when we go into a member state to support their IRRP. So we take them through from, as we call it, from cradle to grid. We take them through the process so that they can go back and interrogate the models that we have developed with them for the future of the planning. And what we'll do now is be what we call a backstopping entity for their development going forward. To your point, Roddy, this second R, resilience, and this multi-stakeholder construct is really speaking about reconfiguration. The resilience aspect of your plan is going to require reconfiguration. That means you'll have to have a series of stakeholders participating. The health sector, the agricultural sector, the Met Office, your disaster preparedness sector, which is going to be important for you to understand. As Devon had mentioned, we are coming from a very standard supply, transmission, distribution to a demand, where now we are going to a reconfiguration whereby we may have a lot more players becoming a part of the sector planning. If you talk to somebody from agriculture, as Collins' project would have indicated, you know, the droughts are going to affect that. That's just going to shift the demand. The electricity demand is going to shift. So we have to get the water sector involved for them to understand their demand profile, and that they may have to do what we call distributed generation. So they might not get their supply, which is what is happening in Barbados, from the main supply system, but they will have created almost like a semi-grid within the larger grid. And what that does, it builds greater resilience in the system. The same thing can happen for the tourism industry. Same thing can happen for residents. You will note that a number of residents are deploying RE because governments have created a more favorable policy framework. However, when it's done properly through a plan, what it does, it creates greater resilience in terms of how distributed generation is going to become more robust within the national grid. And what that does, it actually helps the system to optimize and to become more efficient. I think one of the things about electricity systems is that how it evolved. We have to remember how it evolved. It was coastal because that's where fuel come in, right? And then the electricity system would have expanded towards the middle of the island. But what we are seeing now with climate change, we have to do a reconfiguration because of the level of impacts we are getting on parts of the island while other parts might not, or maybe the whole island. But how we come back up and how we rebound from an impact is going to be critical for us to have continuity in our economies. So that is how the resilience and the multi-sector and the multi-stakeholder works. It's going to mean every man, woman, and child participating in this aspect. And Devon mentioned that demand side, which quite gets a lot of, I think we ignore it quite a bit, but you can harden all of that system and not have a demand to supply to. And I think when we speak about codes, building codes, the CARICOM and Regional Energy Efficiency Building Code is going to be a critical role in how we reconfigure our systems moving forward. Now, as a region, when we look at, that's what I've just mentioned to you is an island. Now, as a region, any one of us could get hit. Any one of us could get hit at any time during a hurricane season. Now, remember, it's not only hurricanes that we're impacted by. We're impacted by droughts. We're impacted by high temperatures. Now, when these things happen, we have to look at how our supply is going to remain secured. So that means your geothermal, your offshore wind, your land-based wind, your combined heat and power using natural gas would also need to be a part of the energy mix. So diversification is going to be critical for robustness and for resilience. So it cannot be only one particular resource that is going to make you resilient. It has to be multi. So we'll have to look at how, as a region, we can now expand that entire supply chain, not just to provide electricity for lights, but for the productive sector. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jackson. I note two hands that came up, the Ambassador, High Commissioner for Britain, and also the representative of Belize. We'll go in that order. I also see, is this BVI? Bermuda.
Thank you so much for an excellent presentation and also for allowing us to be here to participate. But thank you very much. My question is about cost. I think many countries want to scale up their renewable energy, but there's a high startup cost. And you're talking about scale. I wonder whether there's been any discussions about pooled procurement for major commodities, so therefore reducing the cost. We know that many of the islands are relatively small economies, and therefore by some kind of pooled procurement. You mentioned also regional working. Could you elaborate a bit more on that, and whether there's how much cost savings could be achieved by this kind of integrated approach?
Okay, thank you for that question. Let's take Belize, then we'll take Bermuda, and then we invite the team to respond. And there are some questions online. I will invite one of my colleagues to perhaps read those questions for us after this round of engagement. Over to you, Minister from Belize.
Yes, thank you. I think my question is similar to the prior question in terms of costs. I was trying to understand the focus on resilience planning, but integrally tied into that is a financial analysis and looking at each area of risk. I mean, we're talking about risk management effectively, and looking at the vulnerability for generation, vulnerability of the grid transmission, or transmission grid and distribution. So each component and the resilience of each corresponding to the vulnerability of each. But I didn't get an appreciation of the financial analysis associated with that, and that's where my primary inquiry is. When we talk about risk, we also can have a discussion on insurance of that risk. Looking at certain types of generation plants, the costs, as I understand it from a recent conference, can be as much as insurance alone as 3 cents per kilowatt hour. That's certainly quite significant in terms of the impact it can have on overall cost of power. And so when we look at resilience, we have to measure what it impacts, how it impacts on the cost of power as well, and the overall provision or generation of electricity and the distribution of electricity. So all the more, can you speak to the financial side and perhaps whether insurance can play a role in it?
Thank you very much, Minister. Let us take Bermuda, and then I would invite Dr. Gary Jackson and Dr. Devon Gardner to respond.
Hello, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much. Thank you for the presentation by Drs. Gardner and Jackson. Quite familiar with their work and the important work that they're doing for the region. Very much would like to ask, perhaps they can highlight to some attendees, and I'm very glad they've already kind of mentioned a few things that I had in mind to ask about, is that the value of the wider participation of a community in the IRRP process. You've spoken how that's very much a priority, because I think in some cases, perhaps in the past, there has been a tendency for some to feel that only the key stakeholders should be involved with this, who have traditionally participated in around the electricity or energy sector in many communities. But I'm very glad that you highlight that as a very important priority. The other couple things I would like to ask that you might want to perhaps give some further I guess texture to is how is conservation and efficiency built into the resiliency process? Because let's face it, part of the problem with energy is not that it's just that it's costly and sources are limited, but we often use too much of it. And we use too much of it during the wrong times. And we all have to learn to be more efficient with our energy use, just as we strive to be efficient with water use and other sort of natural resources. So how crucial is conservation and efficiency to the success of an IRP process? And have you already identified some jurisdictions that might benefit from joint sort of IRP development because there are some islands that have huge amounts of, like you said, geothermal or hydro capacity, but building a hydro facility just for that island is not economically viable. But perhaps 2 or 3 different island groups could participate in an IRP process or a process where they all would benefit, and to scale, one island doesn't carry the development and ultimate support of such an energy source in like the long term, because even though I know some people complain about that there's a 3-year process for development, but you're actually talking about development when it comes to energy projects that are 30 plus years, 20 plus years in the ultimate sort of development of it. So in some cases, although I know for some people a 3-year development of a sort of business case may seem long and tedious, but you're talking about a project that ultimately you're looking to have a maturity and a length of benefit almost longer than 2 lifetimes. You know, most energy facilities last us 30, 40, 50 years sometimes. I mean, well, like Bermuda's own energy plant, fossil fuel, which we're looking forward to moving away from, has been in place for 100 years. But thankfully, we're on a path to moving away from fossil fuel generation. But I think that's kind of how we have to think about it, that the timelines on energy development and even energy investment and the return is always generational in decades. It's never in a short, like 5, 7, 10-year cycle. But hopefully, I look forward to hearing your answers on those questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. 3 very important points raised. Devon, you want to take the first part of it?
I'll take the first step. Thank you, Minister, and the other colleagues who have, the colleague from the UK for raising the questions. Within the context of, I'll start with the last two, the energy efficiency / energy conservation. The IRRP process weighs heavily on the demand side. We do a lot of demand analysis, and within the context of the demand analysis, included in that demand analysis is really we're seeking to identify how different technology options can provide energy efficiency measures. So energy efficiency measures are modeled within the demand analysis. We use LEAP to do a significant amount of the demand analysis. And for those who are familiar with LEAP, it gives you the option to look at efficient lighting, changing the efficiency of lighting, changing the efficiency of your air conditioning, changing the efficiency of your pumps and different types of systems to see how your demand will change with different types of technological interventions. So energy efficiency is built in completely. Now, energy conservation is always a little bit more tricky because that's a behavioral one. And what we typically try to do is to suggest to countries that once we have done the IRRPs, what we do is do tariff impact analysis, and maybe use the tariff impact analysis to guide, if you want to call it, some of the regulatory incentives that may potentially be able to help to guide conservation, because as I said, conservation is typically more behavioral, and so what you would have to do is to put in things that could help to guide persons to be more conservationists in the way they use energy. But definitely energy efficiency is built in. All the distributed energy resources, technology for distributed energy resources are built in. Rooftop perhaps solar and electric vehicles are built into the process of the IRRP, the way we do it. So that's one. Within the context of multi-country IRRPs, if you want to call it that, yes, it's something that we are very keen on doing. In fact, what we have already started to do, that it is an improvement on what has been happening in some of the countries, because we have been actually doing an integrated resource and resilience plan for countries that normally would have, countries with multiple islands, that would have normally done separate plans for each island, and we are actually doing one plan for the entire country, regardless of whether it's 2 islands, 3 islands, and so on. We are working now in St. Kitts and Nevis, we are working in Trinidad and Tobago, and we treat each country as one country, and it doesn't matter how many islands the country have. And we do a plan that includes all the different options and scenarios for both islands. In the case of St. Kitts and Nevis, we look at options for interconnections and scenarios for interconnections, scenarios that do not include interconnections. But ultimately, it's the stakeholders who determine what they want to be included in the scenarios. So the stakeholders say, look, we want to explore interconnections. Obviously, we will look at it. If they don't, then we can't force it. But what I'm saying is that this gives us an opportunity to use the same approach or a similar approach to look at that multi-country IRRP, so to speak. So the aim of the game is to conclude IRRPs for all countries within CARICOM by the end of 2023, as per the mandate of the CARICOM Energy Ministers. With those if we can get IRRPs that are concluded for all the countries, then that makes it a little easier now to do those multi-country IRRPs, because the data sets that you would have collected at the national level, the models that you would have built at national level, it becomes easier for you to now refine those and look at joining and linking up a multiplicity of those countries to see what the scenario matching could look like as you look at multi-country IRRPs. And that's something definitely that we'll be looking at, especially within the construct of the offshore wind program and the geothermal program. Because if you're going to talk about how to share supplies and how to look at flexible demand that can, in a sense, ensure that you are able to use the benefit of a country which might have demand at one time, a demand profile that is different from another, to obtain security, better security at a national level among a multiplicity of countries. That is something that we'll have to do. And we look forward to being able to conclude a majority of our national IRRPs so that we can begin to mix and match them and see what we can get with multinational IRRPs at a later stage. So that is definitely something that's on the cards. Within the construct of the question from the UK around the joint procurement, it was something that was discussed at significant length in one of it was the 82nd quoted one of the energy ministers meeting in September 2020, and it's something that we have been trying to figure out how to deal with. A significant challenge that we have with respect to joint procurement, to be honest, is that oftentimes it's not just that the countries themselves which are the impediments. A significant impediment tend to be the IFIs and the multilaterals who are financing the projects, because oftentimes they are not allowing you to do joint procurements, and that can limit what the country can do in terms of procurement when you are dealing with different IFIs and different financial institutions who have different procurement rules and different procurement requirements and do not want to join procurement. But it's something that we recognize is important. It will significantly not just reduce transaction costs and unit costs, but it will also improve the timeliness with which we can access certain technologies, because certain technology developers are not going to be interested in supplying small scales of equipment. And if we are able to order in bulk or order in certain quantities, it will improve the rate at which we can get access to certain types of technologies. So it's something that we'll continue to look at working on. We know that we could reduce up to 30% of costs through joint procurement. When we did the analysis, that's what those numbers were suggesting. And obviously we talk about regional projects, and this is something that Gary can talk about in a bit, and also provide an answer to Belize in regard to the question around the financial analysis and how much we are doing on financial analysis.
Thanks, Devon. So yes, we do financial analysis. We have set up even an investment plan, look at what type of tariffs would be required for this to be practical. One of the things that we have come to realize, though, the smaller the system, the more expensive it is. For example, some countries who are considering wind, so for example, 12 megawatts, it's not the same price that you'll get 12 megawatts as it was for 50 megawatts or 100 megawatts. And we realize there can be a price difference in terms of pooling. For example, if I was to do a 60 megawatt, I could save 25% than doing a 10 megawatt plant in wind, for example. But within the financial analysis, we look at, one of the things that we have to look at is what the countries are saying are their resources and what are the options that they want to consider. So we don't tell the countries what they need to consider, but we do give them the outputs of what the financial cost is going to be, and what we call the levelized cost of electricity at the end of the terminal. What is that going to be based on the options that they have? One of the things that we do encourage countries to do is identify where your resources are and try to know if those resources are actually there, and not just say you want to do 10 megawatt of hydro or 10 megawatt of wind. That we have identified a site, because that site is going to indicate or influence the price, because that site could be in the mountains, and just to get stuff there to get it and put a transmission line is going to add to the cost. Because we have to consider the transmission system as well, and we have to consider the distribution system in addition to the generating assets. But we do consider the financial analysis, considering all the components of the project, from the generating assets, what it would take to put it there, and if you need to build a transmission system, and actually a substation, because some of these projects don't have a substation to collect the power before it goes off to its demand. So some of these projects, because of its remote nature, may need to build a substation. So it's going to be a case of where the projects are located, and we try to guide the countries to make sure that the system is optimal in what are some of the things that they consider for us to do the financial analysis. But yes, we do.
Okay.
And before you go, DSG, we do, the question about joint procurement, I think is something that we need to address as a region. I'll give you an example. I'm not going to name the countries, but I'm going to give you the capacities. One country has already 30 megawatt wind. Another country has 10. Another country has 6. Another country has 12. These 4 projects are ready projects. They have done the feasibility study. They are ready projects. Now, if each of these countries consider these projects by themselves, it's going to cost them 25% more on each case than if they do it together. The other thing is, the equipment that is required to install those wind turbines are very specialized equipment. You have to import them. Cranes you have to import. The cost to mobilize those cranes to do a 10 megawatt project is going to be far more than if you were to mobilize it for the 4 projects together. The ships that are required to ship those turbines to you are in high demand. And for them to come to you, for you to book that ship, it's going to take a long time to come to you, right? Turbines are in high demand. And if you try to get turbines for 10 megawatt, it's going to be the US, the UK, Germany, who are going to be doing gigawatts of facilities, who is going to come first. So you're not going to be in the queue. The operations for those turbines, in terms of what you're going to need to operate them, you could actually share that across the region. You can actually build skill sets of wind engineers, for example, across a region, similar to what you do in the disaster response. You have persons like linesmen going from one country to the next. You can actually share those wind engineers amongst yourself instead of importing them, because it's going to cost you more when you import them. So when you hear prices like 10 cents per kilowatt hour in the United States, or 5 cents, it's not replicated here. It's going to cost you more, because you have to do a lot more importation of these larger equipment, because we are so small. So that joint procurement, I think, is something that we have to investigate very, very seriously, because it's going to reduce costs to the end users. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Gary, for that. Yes, let's take one more, and then I will invite Mr. Jean Leon to take us through the final presentation for the afternoon. Over to you, Minister from Montserrat. No.
Just 2 quick points. The matter of procurement and joint procurement, I think, is a big topic on our agenda for some time. during our meeting. So that's been addressed regionally. I think there's a COFAB team that's dealing with that. The issue, however, about projects being dealt with, it'd be useful to have a joint effort, but sometimes it's where you get the funding from and the conditions under which you get the funding. So sometimes it's not quite as easy as that to have 6 different projects in 6 different countries, being joined because of the nature of the funding and other things that are involved. However, I would say to you, it's a good idea, but not quite that easy.
Yes, of course. I mean, as it's always said, the devil is always in the detail, isn't it? So it's never that easy. But I think that the point that Dr. Jackson was making is that as we develop our capacities to respond to the needs of the region, we ought not to consider only a few options, but that we should open up the space as much as possible. And in fact, doing our own production ought not to be taken off the table of consideration. So it's not an easy task. The point made as well about just the cost of having all of this heavy equipment. When we're dealing with a number of small states, very small populations, small infrastructure, just to get a crane to put up a wind turbine. I don't know, Gary, if you can perhaps tell us, the cost of, first of all, where do you get the crane from? How much would it cost you to get that crane on island to put up 100 foot or 100, is it 100 foot or 100 feet or 100 meters wind turbine? These are practical challenges that we have to face as small states. And as when I look around the room, there are not many of our international partners here, but for those who are here, this is where the conversation about partnerships is also going to lead us in the future, because it may seem a simple issue, wind turbines, wind energy, but there is an infrastructural cost behind it that, Gary, perhaps I will give you the last say on that issue before I invite our friend Jean to take us through the last presentation.
Thanks, DSG. So you're right, we do have to import cranes. Some of these turbines are 60, 80, 100 meters hub height. So you can understand the order of magnitude. We don't have cranes like that in the region, so we normally have to import them either from the United States, Canada, or Europe. When you import them, you mobilize them. You have to pay for that, and that has to be spread. For example, if it's 10 megawatts, that has to be spread across the 10 megawatts. And a 10 megawatt system might be 5 machines, 5 2-megawatt machines. So that would be there for a while. And those type of costs can represent maybe 10% or so of your total costs. And you have to be mindful of trying to take that on by yourself. I would discourage it and find ways around. And you mentioned about financing. I think they can create some syndication for development funds to do that. And I think CDB may be able to negotiate with other entities to create a syndication for these type of investments going forward for the region. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in thanking Dr. Gardner and Dr. Jackson for their presentation. And let me take the opportunity now to invite someone who is no stranger to the Caribbean, the President of the Caribbean Development Bank, Dr. Jean Leo. Over to you, Dr. Leo. The technical team, could you assist with the shifting of the slides, please?
Thanks so much, Alexi. So, I don't want to be the last person between you and the end of the day in a very long way. But unlike the last presentation that had a significant amount of excellent information, I want to speak just on one issue today. And the one issue doesn't mean necessarily it is short or it is simple, but I will do my very best to keep it in a way that I think we can all follow and all understand. So the context that we want to talk about today, somehow this thing is not going. The context we want to talk about today is the following. And we've got a little sneak preview in the previous presentation. Small states, as we know it, have significant vulnerabilities. And those vulnerabilities we all know and can identify with. We have structural rigidities we talk about. I call them legacy issues. We have the macro shocks. For example, the current inflation spike that we are getting out of the Ukraine war. We have global spillovers like the global financial crisis or the pandemic that is still going on. And we also have natural hazards, those natural hazards being your storms, hurricanes, volcanoes, and so on that actually occur. And what we do know about those is when you have a shock, you need finance. And you need finance to be able to manage that shock. The problem though is that after you have one of those events, the finance that you can raise is costly because your risk actually goes up after an event occurs. It doesn't go down. And because your risk is up, your finance has to go up. And so we generally say the only way we can manage and manage well is if we have access to concessional finance. But how do we access that concessional finance is a problem. And the problem with it is that every 3 years, the United Nations Committee on Development Policy meets, and they determine what is the appropriate cutoff point for countries to get access to concessional finance. And so in principle, they use, by and large, gross national income per capita as the measure to determine whether you are eligible or not eligible for finance. And that translates into, let's call it a very simple rule. If your per capita GDP is less than $1,200 US dollars, you qualify. If your per capita GDP is twice that, 2,400 US dollars, technically you graduate and you don't qualify. And so in principle, you have the situation where, and especially in our countries in CARICOM, where our per capita GNI is much more than $2,400, that we cannot qualify, we are no longer eligible to get any concessional finance. And therefore, we end up in a situation where the only access we have to finance is non-concessionary finance. And that's a problem that has been with us for, I would say, the last 35 years. And we have not been able to solve that problem. And so what we are proposing, which is the single idea that I want to share with you today, is I think we have an opportunity to now say we have a solution to that problem of replacing GNI by something else. And that something else is what we can think of broadly as the internal resilience capacity of a country. And if we can use that as the means on which to determine eligibility, then we can, in fact, and I will show you as we go through, we can get to a situation where irrespective of whether you have middle income status, or your per capita is $6,000 and $8,000 and $10,000, you will still be able to qualify for this concessional finance. And so that's the object that we want to be able to address. Now, you may want to say, well, why are we making that particular point? And the point is that even when countries' GNI have risen beyond the graduation point, they are not exempt from the shocks that I talked about. In other words, whether you are rich or poor, COVID hit you. Now, it is also the case that whether you are middle income or low middle income, you still have problems with hurricanes, and you still have problems with climate-related issues. And we still have problems at the moment with high debt, and we still have problems with limited implementation capacity. So that treating countries as just a matter of how much income they have per capita is not, in our mind, a useful way of actually considering whether they should and shouldn't have access to finance. And I want to zero in on not all of those vulnerabilities that I talked about, but just natural disasters. And something that I'm sure every one of you would be very much aware of. Hurricane Maria hits Dominica in 2017 with a whopping 700, if you add it up together, $700 million of damage. Soufriere in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, 2021, about $300 million US in damage when you take the loss from things like agriculture and the damage to the economy. Haiti's earthquake in 2021, over $1 billion. And then now Bahamas, Dorian, almost $3.5 billion in terms of damage. Now, what this translates to is, in essence, how do you recover those monies that we are talking about without piling on more borrowing? And if you pile on more borrowing, the first thing that you are going to go against is your debt situation gets worse. And not only would the debt situation get worse, you have no guarantee that the following year or 2 years or 5 years down the road, you get another hit by that very same event, and you need to borrow again. And so you end up in this debt trap. And if you can only borrow at non-concessional, then it means you are stuck in that problem forever. So I want to start this by asking you the question that we asked ourselves. When Hurricane Maria passed as a Cat 5 over Dominica and wiped out Dominica, and that same Cat 5 hurricane went to Florida and equally damaged Florida, which of the two countries you think will recover or did recover fastest? I think it's a no-brainer. Everyone knows Florida recovered in lightning time, and Dominica is still paying the price. And so the question we needed to ask from this is, why is it that a Dominica has such a long recovery time? And is it only Dominica, or is it something that is endemic to a lot of developing countries? And so we came up with the one single idea here, that Florida, for example, has access to federal funds, emergency money that it can crowd in and use almost overnight. That is concessional finance, even if the US has one of the highest per capita GDPs in the world, but they have access to finance. Your Dominica, that does not have that access to finance, has now to say it can only borrow, but borrow at non-concessional rates. And so the question is, how do we establish this? And how do we say we need something that is more equitable, that can be applied to seeds in a way that can be beneficial to them? So, I said over the last 30 to 35 years, we've been thinking about this problem. And what most analysts are now saying is, What we need is a concept of vulnerability. And so you would have heard of the multi-dimensional vulnerability index as the way to solve that particular problem. But I think the point we need to take very deeply into consideration is that we cannot think of vulnerability as simply a susceptibility or a probability of something happening. In fact, we make the point, just as I just did for the US and Dominica in terms of comparing, that even if you have a similar likelihood of an event occurring, and even if the same event occurs and hits two countries at the same time, the real difference between the two is the ability to recover after the event occurs. And it is that difference in terms of how long it takes you to recover that is the real distinguishing factor between a developing country like a Dominica and a developed country like the United States. And I think I can immediately tell you the same thing that the CCREEE people were talking about resilience holds in the broader macro space. When an event occurs, it is your ability to recover, your resilience that really matters, not so much whether you were susceptible before the event actually occurs. So that's the first lesson I think we learned from what we face. Susceptibility is not sufficient. We need to go beyond susceptibility, and it is in terms of the resilience capacity, how long it takes you to recover. The second thing we learned from looking at all of those examples that exist around the world is all finances are not the same. And when we say all finance is not the same, the terms of borrowing have to be different if it is borrowing for rescue purposes immediately after the volcano in St. Kitts, in St. Vincent, or immediately after a Hurricane Hilbert hits Jamaica. That is one type of financing, and that should be distinguished from another type of financing we could call financing for recovery, which would now be, I've already done the cleanup, I've already moved people, now how do I begin the process of recovery? And that requires you to have a different types of terms of financing. And the third is financing for repositioning. And there we are looking at now, my crisis has occurred, I've already begun to recover, but now I need to reposition my economy. And when I reposition my economy, what exactly does that mean? How do I get short-term financing and long-term financing to do my particular needs? And so we believe that what we need is a bridge. That bridge, sorry, I'm not, oh, that's the third, sorry. The first point I made was that susceptibility is not adequate. You need to look beyond that. The second point I made was we need to distinguish financing from rescue and financing for recovery and financing for repositioning. The third big point that we learn is development is a holistic concept. You cannot, in essence, think of development as a slice. And so after an event occurs, a crisis occurs, it is not just the roads that go down. It's not just the electricity lines that go down. People's livelihoods are totally upside down. And so if you have to fix a problem after a crisis occurs, you have to fix the entirety. You cannot fix a part. And the understanding of that is very simple. If you build a system and build a system as a sphere, then it means that that sphere has a certain momentum, a certain way dynamics to move. If you try now to elongate that sphere by increasing it in one dimension and not the rest, then it no longer will revolve as a sphere. It's going to actually stop. And the same thing holds in general on economies. If you design an economy as an interlocking set of systems, you cannot develop pieces of it because by doing this, you change the entire nature of the economy itself. And so we at the bank see development in a holistic way, in a way that says you cannot leave any dimension behind. You have to be able to treat economies as a whole. So what you're looking for in principle is what we can call a bridge. And the bridge is to integrate the three systems that exist at this point in time in the international architecture. There's the debt sustainability framework popularized by the IMF, which is mostly stabilization. You have an investment growth framework that essentially is the work done by the World Bank. And then you have the resilience building framework, which is work done by the United Nations, if we want to call it the SDG framework. And what you need is a framework that integrates those three things. And by integrating them, you will be able to manage both for stabilization, long-term development, and at the same time, resilience building. And so that bridge that we are talking about is what CDB is now calling our vulnerability and resilience framework. And this now is a forward-looking framework that integrates, as I said, the resilience parts, the debt frameworks, and the investment growth frameworks in one. So that's the principle underlying the work that we are doing. And what we end up now saying is, because this is a framework, we need to be able to anchor it in a way into something that can actually be usable. And to go back to the point that CCREEE was making, when you look at vulnerability and you look at resilience, we can make one fundamental statement. You cannot have sustainable development without having resilience. And resilience is not just resilience in environment, as we were just hearing CCREEE saying. It is resilience in productive capacity. It's resilience in social capacity. It's resilience in institutional capacity. And it's also resilience in financing. And so when we were hearing the questions, well, how are we going to finance this? I think that's the flip side. If you're going to have resilience in energy, you have to be able to have financing to do it. And if you're going to have resilience in the social sphere, then you need to have financing to do it. And if you want to have resilience in terms of your productive capacity through economic diversification, you need to have financing to be able to do it. And so we've been pushing that particular line of vulnerability and resilience. And we've come up with this tool, as I said, the internal resilience capacity. And this step, in principle, shows you the difference that our tool is actually seeking to generate. So the first blue step is the existing system that says if you take your GNI, this is what is used for existing concessional finance. If you move to the next level, which is the multidimensional vulnerability index, it is better than the GNI, but it still does not address the resilience issues that you have to compound with if you want to have sustainability. And so that's the third block, which is where we are. We add, on top of the vulnerability, a resilience component in each of the 5 elements of resilience that I talked about, your social, your environmental, the productive, the institutional, and the financial. And when you pull those together, we have what we call now the internal resilience capacity idea. So what is internal resilience capacity? It is essentially the ability of a country to rebound after it has been hit by a shock. And in the same way that we talked about having GNI as 2 thresholds, less than 1,200, greater than 2,400, what we want is an internal resilience capacity measure that says you have high resilience and low resilience. If you have low resilience, it means you have weak capacity to absorb and recover from shocks, as almost all of our countries do. and therefore you should be able to have access to more finance. And if you have high resilience, as in the case of the Floridas that we talk about, you have stronger capacity to absorb and recover from shocks. Partly it could be from your own doing, but equally because of the environment in which you are, the support systems that you actually have. And so I think that slide here, in a sense, captures the entire framework that we are looking to work on. We are saying that in principle, you have a number of shocks that can hit you. They can be internally generated shocks. We call them endogenous shocks. They can be external shocks, like your climate, the earthquake, the health pandemic, droughts. All those are shocks. They will impact your system in different ways. But when the system hits you, there's another dimension that you need to consider. It is the magnitude of that event and the severity with which it hits your system, and therefore the lasting impact that it can have on you, depending on the type and the severity with which it hits. Now, as long as that occurs, then what happens next, which I said was the distinguishing factor, says now, how long does it take me to recover from that particular shock? And inside that space, now that box, there are a number of key things. But the most important, we think, is access to finance. And if we can zero in on this access to finance at affordable rates, we can actually now mirror the ability to recover as a function of some of the things you could be doing on your own. That's your policy side, what we have on the right side as the shock absorbing policy measures that we can be taking. And then the exogenous elements that we need to control for that we really don't have much control over. And that will include things like access to finance, things like ratings and so on. And we can condition that by saying that ability to recover is in itself a function of the type of shock, but it is also an element here is where we were when the shock hit. So we can call this the state of development, your initial conditions at the beginning, the type of event, the severity of the event, and now your ability to recover from this. What are the factors that actually helped you to get out of that particular space? What is within your control to help you reduce that space? And that is the framework that we are going to use to say, by coming up with the internal resilience capacity, and for example, if we were to take two numbers, similar to the 1,200 and the 2,400 US dollars, we could think of a situation where what you have is high internal resilience capacity, you recover very quickly. Medium, you recover on average. Low, it takes you much, much longer. So in that particular case where we have a shock, a climate shock occurring in 2017, the length of time it will take you to recover, even to the same 8,000 that you had, will depend on whether your capacity is high, medium, or low. So that's the first point that we need to, I'll come back to that diagram in a little. But what we think is going to be coming out of this is the following. We can replace the high upper middle income, lower middle income, and low income concessional finance threshold, which is in US dollars per capita income, by a measure of internal resilience capacity. And by doing this, we would simply have a high internal, low internal capacity. And by doing this, what we would end up with, we believe, is our countries that are in the upper middle income and lower middle income category will actually fall in the low internal resilience capacity. And by so doing, we can actually open up room and space for them to be able to get access to affordable finance to meet the needs when we do have a particular crisis. So that is where we are going with this. And so the question really is, how can we show you this in an illustration that you can actually understand? And that diagram here, which we are calling our duration gap, similar to the previous one, takes the case of, let's say, a Dominica, with a per capita GDP of, we are going to use 8,000 US as the particular event. The question is, a shock occurs in 2017. When that shock occurs in 2017, what the international community is going to do is to say, your per capita GDP is $8,000. You are deemed to be higher than 2,400. Technically, you are middle income. Therefore, you cannot borrow concessional. You need to borrow at non-concessional rates. But the truth of the matter is that after the crisis, the shock occurs, it is quite clear your per capita GDP did not remain at $8,000, as in the case of Dominica. It would have had to go down. And by going down, which is this red line that you're seeing at the bottom of the yellow part of the curve, it goes down, and we are illustrating this by, let's say, 2,000 by 2021. And then it takes another 7 years between 2021 and 2028 before it gets back to the $8,000 that you were before the shock occurred. And so the question then is it reasonable to say to a country that you had $8,000 per capita before a crisis, before a shock? That shock will take you essentially 11 years to get back to the 8,000, but yet you want me to be and operate and borrow as if I still had $8,000. And that cannot be fair, cannot be equitable. We need to be able to say, at least for the period from 2017 to 2028, we should have a lower per capita GNI as that which you are using to determine whether or not you have access to concessional finance. And so that was what actually brought this about. And if I can use the evidence now of how do we move from the MVI to this internal resilience capacity that we are talking of, the black line on that chart says, in principle, that this is the projected growth path that you are looking at because of your vulnerabilities. Whether it is because you have a high percentage of your people living near the coast, or you have concentration, or you have some other structural rigidity, your growth path is limited by that black line. So if I were to say a multidimensional vulnerability index, or any vulnerability index for that matter, is going to be used for access to finance, what it really says is, if I were to shift that, then that line would move upwards, because my potential is limited by the vulnerability that I have. But what we've just argued is when the event occurs and a crisis hits, a storm hits, that measure of vulnerability is also going to change, because my ability to recover actually takes a hit. And so we need to be able to capture this element of how much of a hit that I need to be able to have, which means we have essentially two models that we can use. One model is to develop this internal resilience capacity, have an index with two benchmark points, let's call it 0.35 and 0.7, and say if your resilience is less than 0.35, you qualify for concessional. If your resilience is over 0.7, you don't qualify. In between is discretionary, and so income doesn't matter. It is your ability to recover, your resilience. The alternative is to say you can actually keep the same per capita GNI, but you need to adjust it. And you need to adjust it for the fact that your per capita GNI will go down after the event occurs, and it will stay lower for a long period of time. And so we should use the adjusted measure as a means of seeing how much of the per capita GNI now qualifies you for your access to finance. And that was what we called the recovery duration adjuster. Recovery, because it's talking about how long it takes you to recover. Duration, which is the period of time. And adjuster means we can adjust the GNI. And by adjusting the GNI, what we come up with is now a more equitable measure of GNI that can be used for concessional finance. So that's the two sides. The model itself is internal resilience capacity. It can be applied to any country in the entire universe of United Nations countries. It will determine whether it is you have high or low or middle capacity in resilience. And we can now determine concessional finance not on GNI, but on your internal resilience capacity. But if we want to zero this in a way that is equivalent to what everybody else understands, GNI, we can do the equivalent of now calculating what is the loss that occurred as a result of that event, and now we can reduce the GNI before the event occurred to the appropriate GNI after the event occurred, depending on the type of event, the magnitude of the event, and now say this is the adjusted GNI that you would need to use for concessional finance. So that's where we are at the moment in the development of this. And notice here what actually happens, we can see when you have multiple shocks, as in the case of hurricanes that start in 2017, but before you even get to 2028, when you recover to your 8,000, you have another shock. It doesn't have to be another hurricane. It could be a macro shock, but now it hits you and you go further down, which means that your ability to recover moves not in 2028, but 2033. But throughout that time, that longer duration, you are still using the per capita GNI that you had before. I remember speaking with the premier from Montserrat, and he was making the point that for a long time after the volcano erupted, the per capita GNI that was being used was still the per capita GNI before the volcano erupted. Because, one, you didn't have an alternative, but because, two, vulnerability indices or per capita GNI indices simply work backwards. They measure what has happened, not where you are and where you need to be as a means of taking a forward-looking stance. And so that gives you the idea of multiple shocks, which extends duration and means that the more prone you are to shocks, and by extension in a climate environment where intensity, ferocity of climate-related actions are actually intensifying, then it makes it even more reason why you need to be taking into account the forward trajectory, the forward evolution of those shocks, not the backward-looking one that you actually need, because it impacts your duration in a very, very different way. So at this point where we are is we are looking to build strategic partners in terms of the modeling of the internal resilience capacity tool, not just for the Caribbean, but essentially for the entire 190 countries in the United Nations. Because by doing that, we can, in principle, now say we have a tool that can replace GNI, because GNI is measured by the entire 190 plus countries in the UN system. And we can say it out to the UN Committee on Development Policy, GNI has run its course. What we need is to adopt the internal resilience capacity as the measure to determine the access to concessional finance. And just as a closing rider, this is all about using the existing concessional finance to greater effect, because that concessional finance is already there. What we are saying is we can make it more equitable and we can make it more relevant to our countries. That's a separate argument from we need more concessional finance, because that's new. Okay, that's a separate argument. And it's equally a separate argument too, we need debt relief. And the debt relief part is another element where we can say the mountain of debt that we are talking about actually is in a large part because of the repeated crises that we have been having forever and ever. And each time the hurricane comes, it takes away the buildings, takes away the roads, but leaves the debt. And you borrow again and you add more debt. But your debt is rising, and so we need to think about those three things. So there's existing concessional, new concessional, and there's debt. And each of those now, we require different solutions. They're not the same. But this particular tool we are talking about now is using better, more equitable, existing concessional finance by turning the tide away from using GNI as the determining factor of allocation to internal resilience capacity as the unit of, or the criterion of choice. And that we want to be able to use, not, as I said, for the region, but the entire community, the entire world. And that's what raises the bar here now. The concept we are pushing and piloting across as many institutions and framework fora that we have, and the actual calibration of the model is being done, but we do need to take a lot more time in terms of coming up with something that is universally acceptable, universally applicable, and at the same time has the simplicity of a GNI 1200, 2400, IRC 0.5, 0.7. And if we can get that done and done very quickly, we stand the chance of having the Caribbean pioneer a distinct problem that has plagued us for the last 30 to 35 years. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Leo. I think Jean started off by telling you that the presentations before his was so rich that he intended to be as simple and as brief as possible. So I'm not sure to what extent he achieved that. One thing I know that he certainly achieved was to show to us in this room that the Caribbean has the capacity to lead in areas that the rest of the globe has refused to step forward and to deal with. So before we even start with comments, I just wanted to join me in really, really congratulating the Caribbean Development Bank for pioneering work in this area, because we have been struggling with this for quite a while. The United Nations Development Program has put out for many years now the Human Development Index, and that has not shifted the needle in terms of using other matrices for determining development. If we can get this particular model forward, the recovery duration adjuster, I think that can be both path-breaking, and it will also show that the Caribbean is not just a region that talks about problems, but that also put forward solutions to those issues that are dogging us on a regular basis. So I see two hands up. I will start with the one that I saw first, and then I will come to Minister from Suriname. So please just identify yourself, and then we take the two comments, ask Jean to respond, and then we shall take perhaps another couple or triple questions or comments. Over to you, sir.
Sandy, Ambassador of Spain. So the question is, so what are the next steps forward in terms of both on the technical dimension and also on the advocacy, and what are the obstacles? So where are the obstacles to get it, let's say, universally accepted, and finally, what is the calendar? Because to me, well, coming from a country that is sensitive to that kind of realities, and that we don't see why we are actually supporting it. So what is preventing you from getting it universally accepted? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I'll take that one just because I think it's so important. This is because in a large part, there is a lot of a political element for the advocacy that we are talking about. I think the entire world is seized with you need to get rid of GNI and you need to replace it by something, and the whole debate has now been on which multidimensional vulnerability index you're going to use, because there are many out there. However, they have all focused on being an index, and they've all focused on being backward-looking. As far as I know, our concept is the only one that is forward-looking, that is dynamic, that integrates vulnerability with resilience. And it is the only one that specifies that the distinguishing factor is not income, it is not vulnerability, which is ex ante a susceptibility issue, but it is the duration of recovery, your internal resilience that matters. So what it means is we have to be able to sell this idea, and we first put this idea out there at last year's COP in Glasgow, and I've been on the circuit promoting it. Costa Rica, at the ALIDE conference, we have done it in the OASIS stakeholders. When I leave, I am going to New York at the ECOSOC to actually present that very line. We are meeting with OASIS again in the end of August. There is an opportunity to present it at the Secretary General this morning of the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States. So we are having a large body of United Nations countries that are beginning to see that this is a viable construct that one can use, but we do not yet have, as it were, advocacy from the Caribbean. And so that becomes a useful space where our governors could, or the heads can state there is an interest to encourage or to further develop this going forward. The second point of interest is that the United Nations has set up a high-level panel. And that high-level panel that is actually co-chaired by our Prime Minister from Antigua, Prime Minister Brown, has until the end of this year to make a choice or a recommendation of a choice on which vulnerability index they would like the UN to adopt. And so from our perspective on an advocacy line, time is of the essence. We would have to be able to be sufficiently aggressive in advocacy that by the end of this year, the high-level panel can report to the United Nations that they believe of the vulnerability indices that are out there that say the IRC of the CDB is at least a strong candidate, if not the better candidate going forward. So we have those few months. The second part, which is the empirics that you talk about, the modeling is more one of ensuring that we have robustness, so that's technique, and acceptability, universal acceptability. And for that, I think the technique that I think is more promising is we simply need to crowd in partners. As many institutions that are willing to join, be part of, and help develop the empirical calibration, then it means that we would all have come up with the numbers at the same time. And so by 2023, when the documents that will be going to the United Nations Committee on Development Policy would meet, then they would be able to say, this is not just CDB calibrating on the Caribbean, it would be CDB and others calibrating on the entire 193 member body of the United Nations. So that's the work that is to be done. We have started, but clearly, as I said, we need to meet the acid test. Universally acceptable, it has to be robust, and it must be simple enough to understand. And I think the only part we need is the universal acceptability, which is part of the problem on the advocacy that we talked about, and how much momentum can we build between now and the end of the year. So that's the ask is, we need that support, because as I think it was Alexi was saying, the region has the opportunity to say we can lead the world in a problem that has plagued us for the last 30-odd years. But the advocacy is as important as the technical work.
Thank you very much, Dr. Leon. Minister?
Yes, thank you very much, Chair. Well, I have to start with extending my compliments to Dr. Leon. He's got me really fired up with his presentation. I think this undertaking is very bold and daring. Yet I expect it to yield a very interesting result, as there's a lot of criticism about the use of GNI. But what I didn't hear are three particular issues that are weakening the use of GNI, which is inequality in countries, informalities, which sometimes are, the same, and weak institutes. And I believe that all these three elements are very important in recovering. If we don't have these, if we don't have an answer to these elements, I believe recovery will be very challenging. Now, so my first question is, how does this system take in any way care of inequalities? How do we deal with highly informalized countries like ours? And how do we make sure that countries build resilience if institutes are weakened? You mentioned, and when you started, you mentioned Florida as opposed to one of our countries, that Florida can bounce back faster, much faster. I don't think it's just a matter of finance. I think it's also a matter of having finance and the systems in place and people that are there to help them recover, which is something that we lack in the entire Caribbean and for sure in Suriname. And of course, there's this mantra now to build back better, okay? We're talking recovery here, which means recovering. If we were at 0.5 and because of the shock we fell to 0.2, the aim here is to go back to 0.5. But this is not what we're saying. This is not the new mantra. The new mantra is, okay, we're facing the shocks, we're getting some punches, and at some point when we recover, if we can find the means to recover, we need to build back better. So my question is, do we, when the financing is available at some point, do we take care of this issue of building back better? And then there's the issue of multiple shocks, which is what we have seen in the past few years. COVID shock, even before the COVID shock, the Caribbean was dealing already with the debt trap, high debt to GDP ratios. So a couple of shocks coming our way. And again, the solution is more financing or better access to financing, which is fine. But I wonder if we have a new indicator to make available financing, aren't we entering again in a new debt trap? Aren't we adding to the existing debt? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for this, Minister. Let me probably indicate all of what you said are accommodated in the new framework. Everything that you've said. I pointed out the access to finance as a significant component because that is the Achilles heel that, recall, we were starting with, what we needed to solve. How do we get access to more affordable finance? That was the issue you're trying to solve. But when you think of what internal resilience capacity means, we are saying what are the factors that will allow you to recover? And what will allow you to recover is one, as we say, do I have money? Meaning, can I access at affordable rates? But equally, it says, what can I do as policy? What can I do of my own efforts? In other words, I don't want to be in a situation where you say, having gotten some funds, concessional funding, I squander it. And so that moral hazard element needs to be taken into account so that you could say the money, the concessional money you get on your own accord is actually there. That's included. Inequality and informality are attributes of the economies. And so as you are looking to indicate now, understand what determines the internal resilience capacity of a country. Remember, I said it applies to every country in the world. What I can now do is to say there are certain countries, if I classify them highly developed, middle, less developed, where the level of informality is a constraint on development, where the level of inequality is a constraint, where your quality of resources, skills is a constraint, where your infrastructure deficit is a constraint. So all of those are included in the modeling. But when you take all of that into account, you're still left with, I do need adequate and affordable finance, because you cannot do anything in any modern economy without money. So that is why we signaled and zeroed in on this, because that's the argument we want to make, that more access to affordable finance is an essential element. But we cannot leave out all of the other things you talk about. And multiple shocks are equally easily captured, because it means when I get the second shock before I have recovered, then it means I go further away, and the length of time for recovery actually increases. And you're perfectly right. The whole idea of saying the recovery is to recovery where you were before, hence the word recovery, is to give you a measure of how long it takes to get back to where you were before. But the real issue of development is going beyond where you were, because if not, there's no development. And hence why I use the word recovery. You have not had growth. It's taken you 7-10 years to recover where you were, means you have not grown. You have not grown. It appears that you are growing 3, 4, 5%. So when we say at the time of COVID, you have countries falling in 2020 by 20%. The following year, they grow by 8%. And the following year, 5%. Even if I add that up, they are still not yet where they were before COVID. And so even if it looks like I'm growing, I still have zero growth. I haven't had growth. It's still in recovery phase. So using recovery is just a means of trying to capture the length of time it takes to get back to where you were. And then it's another journey to go beyond where you are. But guess what? Irrespective of whether it is you are recovering from a crisis or you are growing post-recovery, what matters is still your internal resilience capacity. That is the beauty of the tool. It can be used at any point in time for any country, and you can measure it, and you can benchmark it, and say, I can come up with countries that are either low, middle, or high. To replace GNI of 12,000, of 1,200, GNI of 2,400. That's the simplicity we are looking for. But the richness of all of the things you are talking about, including moral hazard from not utilizing concessional funds appropriately, can be captured within the confines of the model.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm looking around the room to see whether there are any other hands up. I'm not seeing any. Maybe this might be a sign of your wariness, not a sign of your interest in the topic. But certainly I think Dr. Leon has given us quite a bit of food for thought. I saw, and I can still see heads nodding around the room. Jean, I really wish you and the team at the CDB well in this endeavor. It certainly would be something that the rest of the Caribbean would be continuously interested in its development. I'm certain you would agree if I say that this is still a work in progress, and therefore comments, interventions, suggestions as to how to improve it, I'm certain would be welcome by you and your team. It has been, Dr. Leon said 30 years, it probably is more since we've been dealing with this issue of GDP, GNI, and we've not yet been able to convince the international community that a small country in the Caribbean, which is classified as middle income or high income, is only one disaster away from collapse. We have not been able to convince the international community. And therefore, we have to ensure that models that are developed, particularly indigenous models such as that which was presented this afternoon, should be taken seriously, interrogated obviously, because when we go out to the international community with such a model, we want to go out with the best in class and to be able to return from that international negotiation with something that is embraced. And I heard Eugene talk about, crowding in and ensuring that we get other partners on board to support us. So thank you very much for that, that presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. I did promise that we were going to have the other two presentations available in the event that you had any question. But before asking them to join us at the front, I want to get an indication from you as to whether or not there are lingering questions in your minds for Dr. Colin Young and the duo of Dr. Jackson and Dr. Gardner. If you have no questions, no comments for the two gentlemen, and if you have no more for Jean Leon, I want to take the opportunity to thank you for being an active audience this afternoon. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is the first time that we're having a side event. So we do hope that come next Heads of Government meeting, it will become a regular feature of the week, and therefore the participation will also be much higher. So thank you very much for showing up, and enjoy the rest of your evening.